to speak now more about the new parliamentary reality for the ANC and as well as the National Government of Unity. We're now joined by political analyst Mr. Dirk Kotze. Professor, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. Perhaps let's start off here. I mean, just yesterday we saw that announcement from the ANC President, President Cyril Ramaphosa, when it comes to the decisions taken by the ANC. And firstly, your thoughts of, this proposed National Government of Unity.
Well, I think this is the choice of the ANC, which is possibly the most inclusive one. It is the one which is avoiding the problems of having a coalition government either with the DA and related parties or with MK or EFF and other parties more towards the left. Because what has been the situation on the ground is that though the leaders might be able to work together, it seems like the followers of the different parties have certain reservations about working with parties on the opposite side. So a government of national unity is avoiding that. It's in a sense a safe option or an easier option as a form of a coalition government. But at the same time, it's because it's much bigger, it means it will have to be much more managed than a smaller coalition of just over 50%. We've had a government of national unity, as we all know, in 1994. It was a different form of government of national unity than the one that is now in the pipeline. That one was a negotiated one. This one is because there's not a majority party. So we should not compare the two in all respects. There are certain elements that will be similar, but many elements that will be very different. I think also one should be careful to look at it as a coalition that will include almost all of the 18 parties that will be represented in Parliament. I think in the end, after all these negotiations have been completed, and if they indeed agree on a government of national unity, it might include maybe only 5 or 8 parties.
And when it comes to, some of the responses we've seen from various political formations and parties, I mean, the EFF has come out strongly rejecting this and saying that, well, it refuses to work with the likes of the DA as well as the Freedom Front Plus.
Yeah, we can see there are two styles that's been used by the different parties. On the one hand is MK and the EFF that make sort of public preconditions for their involvement, and then on the other side, the DA and the IFP that basically keeps quiet. They don't put any preconditions in the public domain. I think what especially the EFF and MK is doing is trying to actually talk more to their own supporters than becoming involved in a type of negotiations in the public. It's a risky approach because it can ultimately prevent them from becoming involved in the later stages of these negotiations. I think we must also say that this is still very early. In the negotiations. We should not reach any conclusions at this point in time, and it will go over, I would think, into sort of late next week before we will start to have a better understanding where we are. These negotiations are typically confidential, and we in the public won't know really what's going on in these negotiations until a very late stage.
And of course, the reason why we're having this conversation is also because the ANC failed to get a 50+1 majority, or 50% plus 1 majority. And, this will definitely result in less ministerial posts for the ANC, especially during a time where they are negotiating with various political parties.
Yes, that's indeed so. And in terms of the total number of members of parliament, I think it's 71 members less than in the previous parliament. It's a major decline for the ANC from that point of view. It's also, I think, something like 9 ministers over and above those that have indicated that they will retire. It's another 9 who didn't make it to this new parliament. So from that point of view, it's a major change. It's almost a radical change that is happening within the ANC and the leadership of the ANC. Those persons who will be will be presented by the ANC as the members of the cabinet. We must also remember that the more parties there are in the government of national unity, the less places there will be available for the ANC ministers, because they have to share the positions in the cabinet. And therefore, the more there are, as I said, the less opportunities for ANC persons to become cabinet members.
And how will the ANC navigate this, especially now when we've seen a number of their ministers who actually don't even form part of the MPs, and those, one would say, with a lot of experience, just like the International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor?
Yes, I think what we must anticipate is a very much a different cabinet, that there will be some members of the ANC who served in the current cabinet, because they are still the cabinet that's functioning until the inauguration of the new president. That's quite a small number of them will be able to continue or be in different positions. I think what we have to take into account is that a very important component of the negotiations for a government of national unity is, first of all, about how many ministers for each party, and then in which positions. We've seen, for example, that the EFF talks about the Minister of Finance, that Patriotic Alliance talks about the Minister of Home Affairs. These are all the claims that they are making, but that's going to be negotiated. That will be a very important component of the negotiations to establish a coalition government. And only thereafter we will be able to say, well, this is how the cabinet, as well as the deputy ministers, we must not forget about them. That is part of the agreement that will have to be concluded amongst all the parties.
And Prof, at the same time, we also do know that President Cyril Ramaphosa did sign a number of policies just before we headed into the May 29 polls. And one would say, now that, they only have 40%, how will policies be impacted in Parliament?
Well, I think this is normally for coalitions that have time to negotiate the agreement. That forms a very important part of it, of how the different policy positions will be developed. The main principles of those policies, normally they try to agree on. In our case in South Africa, we don't have that time. So there will be only the most general principles, the values, and that we've seen the ANC already, as well as the DA already declared what they regard as the fundamental values that must underpin such an agreement. But the details of policies will simply be impossible to negotiate before the time. But we've seen, for example, in the case in 1994, was that the ANC won the election on the basis of the policy of the RDP. And afterwards, the three parties, the ANC, the NFP, and the IFP, worked on a white paper on the RDP and in the end approved it. So I think something similar can ultimately develop also, that after they have established the coalition, they will agree on processes in order to talk about a common policy or common points of departure for policies.